So I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm technologically inept, so I'm just going to read my paper. So good afternoon, everyone. I echo the, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I know, I'm tired too, but like, whew, we're almost done, sort of. Okay, so I want to echo the thanks to Karen and Sarah and everybody else who put this symposium together and brought us all out here to speak about this very important subject. The title of my paper is The Question of Reparations, Antiradicalism, Anti-Blackness, and the Impossibilities of Repair. So I'm going to offer what will likely be some errant remarks about the problems and possibilities of reparations. I'll start with a discussion of anti-radicalism and anti-blackness, which I argue are endemic in the U.S. racial capitalist state, and with some background on super exploitation, which I believe to be the material condition of persons racialized as Black in the United States and throughout the African diaspora. This structural relationship was set to work by transatlantic enslavement and continued through direct colonial administration, Jim Crow and apartheid, ghettoization and the mapping of purported Black pathology onto physical space, dependency, underdevelopment, and neocolonialism, the crushing of the Black left, and the containment and warehousing of Black people, especially Black workers, in jails, prisons, and other carceral spaces. I will then discuss the efforts of racialized and oppressed peoples in the PanAfrican Congress of 1945, the Bandung Conference of 1955, the Non-Aligned Movement of 1961, the Tricontinental Conference of 1966, and the 1974 New International Economic Order proposal to demand repair and redress for histories of expropriation, dispossession, domination, subjection, and plunder. These demands included sovereignty, self-determination, economic development, redistribution, disarmament, and a durable peace. Next, I will discuss the possibilities and problems of more contemporary movements and programs for reparations throughout the African diaspora, with a specific focus on the interventions of Queen Mother Audley Moore, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, also known as Cobra, and the program offered by Sir Hilary Beckles. I will end with some ruminations on the ethical, epistemological, and political dimensions of reparations. So anti-Blackness can be understood as a legitimating architecture that devalues, distorts, criminalizes, and abjects persons racialized as Black to rationalize their exclusion, exploitation, domination, and oppression. Anti-radicalism is defined as the disciplining of communists, socialists, internationalists, and other leftists deemed a threat to capitalist expansion and its liberal statist pedagogy. These technologies of repression are mutually constitutive foundations of the U.S. racial capitalist state because both Blackness and radicalism have historically represented an un-Americanness, non-citizenship, dangerous threat, and subversion. The protracted repression of Black folk because of their embodied threat to the racialized socioeconomic order was deployed against radicals that likewise threaten the system of capitalist accumulation organized around the U.S. imperialist state. At the same time, as Carol Boyce Davies writes, quote, that the activities of those who struggle for rights against racist domination were identified as subversive in every instance and were always linked to communism or called communism outright, reveals an important connection between U.S. state repression and racism, end quote. In other words, anti-radicalism mutated struggles for racial justice and Black liberation into subversion and sedition because they threaten the racial capitalist hierarchies constitutive of the U.S. state. I offer this discussion to underscore that reparations must exceed racial justice to account for the despair and destruction wrought by capitalist exploitation and expansion and its concomitant regimes of dehumanizing violence. With respect to super exploitation, radical Black scholars and activists have long argued that the conjuncture of imperialism, white supremacy, and capitalist exploitation has an especially detrimental impact on Black people. For example, in his 1929 report to the Second World Congress of the League Against Imperialism, the prominent Black communist James Ford insisted that the current stage of capitalist development, what he called the epoch of imperialism, was characterized by the consolidation of Africa's partition and the complete enslavement of its people, the arresting of industrialization, which hindered the development of the toiling masses, and the relegation of the continent to a source of raw material, a market for European goods, and a dumping ground for accumulated surplus capital. In the United States, Blacks suffered an intensification of exploitation by white big business and the rising Negro bourgeoisie that supported the subjection of the Black working class. The exacerbation of these conditions by rigid racial barriers, disenfranchisement, and lynching gave Black exploitation its special character, which is superexploitation. Likewise, the West Indies, subjected to U.S. militarism and occupation, was largely transformed into a marketplace for American goods. We charge genocide, the seminal petition submitted to the United Nations by the left-wing Civil Rights Congress in 1951, thrust the peculiar suffering of U.S. Blacks onto the international stage. It meticulously documented the past and present subjection of Blacks to institutionalized oppression through constant and invariable discrimination in employment, low wages, enforced living in ghettos, denial of equality of accommodation and services, as well as equality in the courts. The petition further argued that superexploitation was sustained by genocidal terror, white supremacist law, and the drive of monopoly capitalists for super profits. Another aspect of Black superexploitation was the use of redbaiting, anti-communism, and other technologies of anti-radical repression, from the House Un-American Activities, inquisitions, to COINTELPRO, to surveil, incarcerate, deport, discipline, and discredit Black radical scholars, activists, and intellectuals who advocated, among other things, Black self-determination, liberation, international cooperation, and economic equity. A 1949 quote from W.E.B. Du Bois aptly sums up this reality. Quote, "We invent witch words. If in 1850 an American disliked slavery, the word of exorcism was abolitionist. He was a nigger lover. He believed in free love and murder of kind slave masters. He ought to be lynched and mobbed. Today the word is communist. Never mind its meaning in a man's mind. If anybody questions the power of wealth and advocates civil rights for Negroes, he is a communist, a revolutionist, a scoundrel, and is liable to lose his job or land in jail." End quote. Perhaps the most sophisticated argument about superexploitation came through the advancement of triple exploitation as a means of analyzing Black women's structural location. In 1936, the lifelong leftist Louise Thompson employed triple exploitation to explain that Black women's oppressive relationship to the mode of production was based on their race, gender, and subordination in the labor market. That same year, Black militants Marvell Cook and Ella Baker published The Bronx Slave Market, an article in which they explained that the conjuncture of racialized womanhood and structural poverty, which was deeply intensified by the Great Depression, forced domestic workers to pauperize their labor for the abysmal wage of less than 30 cents an hour. Additionally, Claudia Jones's 1949 article, An End to the Neglect of the Problems of the Negro Woman, Frances Beale's 1969 treatise, Double Jeopardy, To Be Black and Female, and the work of organizations including the Third World Women's Alliance and the Combahee River Collective conveyed that superexploitation of Black people was a function of racism, class domination, heterosexism, capitalist patriarchy, and elitism, and could only be repaired and redressed through anti-racism, anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, anti-sexism, and redistributive political activism and struggle. I now want to shift my focus to some different visions of liberation, repair, and redress. In the aftermath of World War II, racialized and oppressed people demanded an end to structures of domination that had resulted not only in 2 world wars, but also in the entrenchment of white supremacist capitalist imperialism. Those who suffered under the yoke of colonialism and Jim Crow were no longer willing to submit to the fantasies of Western civilization and white superiority. They demanded economic, political, cultural, and epistemological autonomy. The 1945 PanAfrican Congress in Manchester, England, which was heavily influenced by the World Trade Union and Subject Peoples Conferences held earlier that year, emphasized the right of all colonized nations to be self-determining, self-governing, and to control their own destinies. Participants insisted upon emancipation for the whole of the Black world. They explicitly excoriated capitalism and the rule of profit for undermining democracy, freedom, and peace, foreign imperialist control for exploiting and dispossessing indigenous populations, and white supremacist oppression for its impediment to the flourishing of racialized populations. They emphasized that peasants, workers, and the laboring classes were the key actors in throwing off colonialism and imperialism, and expressed their solidarity with other third world populations. The Bandung Conference, held from April 18th through 22nd, 1955, in Bandung, Indonesia, is one of the best examples of Afro-Asian solidarity that was instrumental in rejecting Euro-American hegemony. As the first conference that explicitly excluded European participation, it aimed to build a sustained campaign against imperialism, colonialism, and white supremacy, and to emphasize nation-building, geopolitical autonomy, and world peace. This meeting of anti-colonial and anti-racist colored nations presented a challenge to the United States given its abysmal racial record, its support of European colonialism, and its own practices of colonization in the South Pacific and in the Caribbean. Conference participants sought to cultivate a locus of power and leadership independent of the United States, the West, and the Soviet Union that will ultimately lead to economic and political autonomy predicated upon the cooperation of Africa and Asia. Participants understood that colonialism, imperialism, and exogenous economic formations that disregarded historical and material specificities undermined independence and must be rejected. 6 years after the Bandung Conference, the Nonaligned Conference was convened in Belgrade, Serbia from September 1st through 6th, 1961. This meeting was especially significant given that a number of countries, especially in Africa, had recently gained independence. The purpose of the conference was to discuss international issues and foreign policy and to contribute solutions to security, peace, and cooperation. The non-aligned countries aimed to shape the transition from the old established order predicated on colonialism, imperialism, and neocolonialism to the new order in which emerging nationalist forces were at the forefront. The end of conflict, the cessation of the epoch of foreign oppression, and peaceful coexistence, they argued, required a fundamental reconstitution of social relations and cooperative economic development, as well as the vehement rejection of the Cold War in forms of interference, intimidation, and intervention that undermined self-rule. The latter had only led to a sense of helplessness and hopelessness that negated world progress. Similar to resolutions passed in Manchester in 1945 and Bandung in 1955, non-aligned conference participants affirmed the right of all nations to self-determination, to independence, to control their own resources, and to ensure conditions of subsistence for their populations, as well as to choose whatever social, political, economic, and cultural system they saw fit. The Solidarity Conference of the Peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, commonly known as the Tricontinental Conference, convened in Havana, Cuba, starting on January 3, 1966. More than 500 representatives from national liberation movements, guerrilla organizations, and independent governments of some 82 countries gathered to forge a radical internationalist, anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, and anti-racist challenge to both the United States and the Soviet Union's hegemony, and the Soviet Union's policy of peaceful coexistence. Attendees supported revolutionary nationalism as an essential phase of the struggle against colonialism, underdevelopment, capitalist imposition, and political disenfranchisement. However, the national phase was neither a final solution nor a sufficient means of combating political, economic, or technical exploitation. Those maladies, it was argued, could best be resolved through tricontinental coordination, solidarity, and mutual comradeship. It was only through such unity that imperialism and foreign imposition could be eradicated, that neocolonialism could be revealed, combated, and ultimately eliminated, and that modes of development endogenous to and beneficial for the formerly colonized could be theorized and implemented. Likewise, those in attendance overwhelmingly agreed that socialism and third world liberation were inextricable. Finally, the new International Economic Order Proclamation of 1974 argued for an alternative to the US-led Bretton Woods model that, by 1971, had resulted in slow economic growth, stagflation, and increased spending on armaments. Global South countries sought to remedy the effects of 30% of the world's population, controlling 8% of the world's income and wealth, manifested in concentration of military power and arms production, accumulation of technical advance, and monopoly on industrial power in the global north, the bulk of trade taking place among developed countries, the hegemony of Western multinational corporations, and the high GNP per capita of rich countries and high indebtedness of poor countries. The Group of 77, nations considered to be part of the third and fourth worlds, used the United Nations as a forum to demand a cancellation of debt, a redirection of the benefits of global integration to the global south, a democratic international order predicated on the sovereignty, regulation of a democratic international order predicated on true sovereignty, regulation of transnational corporations, technology transfers from north to south, an increase in commodity prices, and preferential and non-reciprocal trade policies for developing countries. Together, these stipulations articulated a vision of economic sovereignty for countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Julius Nyerere, president of Tanzania, called this arrangement a trade union of the poor, which ultimately amounted to socialism among the states. As we can see, the programs discussed above were global in scope, moving beyond provincial demands that would only benefit individual groups and nations. Importantly, these enunciations of repair and remedy required a reversal of expropriation. That is to say, the countries that had developed as a result of dispossession and plunder would be required to concede massive portions of their wealth and resources. Imperial and colonial countries would also have to surrender the power to shape and implement global policy to the nation states that had been, and continue to be, negatively impacted by them. Moreover, peace and disarmament were essential features of these visions of global prosperity and flourishing. Of course, there have been more concrete models that speak directly to the issue of reparations, offered by a multitude of groups, including the Black Radical Congress, the African Reparations Movement, and the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe. Likewise, numerous scholars and professors, such as Robert Allen, William Darity, and Clarence Munford, have quantified the cost of slavery and racial discrimination. I will focus only on a few of these proposals that move beyond the discourse of individual payments to focus on institutional autonomy, international movement building, and collective economic flourishing. In 1955, Queen Mother Audley Moore founded the Reparation Committee of Descendants of United States Slaves, which called for compensation and amends for the loss or damage of African American lives, labor, skill, and share of property. The $500 trillion that would accrue to 25 million African Americans will be used for poverty alleviation, economic advancement, and employment at every level of industry. Moore envisioned reparations as an alternative to civil rights, not least because the goal was not integration and incorporation into the state, but rather economic self-sufficiency, cultural relocation, and political independence for Black communities. Relatedly, she understood reparations to be connected to part of a larger African decolonization struggle struggles that were happening elsewhere at the time. In 1987, the National Coalition for Blacks for Reparations in America, in Cobra, founded by Imari Obadele, presented a document to the U.S. Congress entitled "Enact to Stimulate Economic Growth in the United States and Compensate in Part for the Grievous Wrongs of Slavery and the Unjust Enrichment which Accrued to the United States Therefrom." Speak about whoever mentioned long titles earlier, that's a long-ass title. Along with a separate Black state in the South, the plan demanded no less than $3 billion per year for African Americans. 1/3 would go to Black families, 1/3 would go to the elected government of the separate Black state, which would be called the Republic of New Africa, and 1/3 would go to a national congress of organizations in the U.S. comprised of churches, civic organizations, and local movements dedicated to the social, economic, political, and educational progress of Black folk. They also demanded the freedom of political prisoners and nonviolent Black prisoners with cash reparations. In addition, Cobra worked in local Black communities to raise awareness about reparations and to organize and mobilize residents for reparations campaigns. Its global vision included advocating for the cancellation of debt on the African continent, the return of stolen objects, and the recognition of the slave trade as a crime against humanity. Drawing insight from sources ranging from Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery to Randall Robinson's The Debt, What America Owes to Blacks, Sir Hilary Beckles has argued for the past decade that the British state must compensate the descendants of enslaved Africans and decimated Native populations in the Caribbean for centuries of suffering, injustice, racialized brutalization, terrorism, exploitation, and impoverishment. He argues that reparations are a legal, political, and moral right, and that grassroots organizations and political networks should harness international law to demand reparations as opposed to settlement. The latter seeks to give victims cash or material awards without admitting responsibility or accepting liability for the harm done, and to settle the matter in a single action with no future obligation. In contrast, reparation requires an apology, admission of criminal liability, and a true commitment to repair damage. Sources of redress include property, wealth, access to education, health care, social standing, credit and opportunity and advancement, a system of entitlements that the descendants of slave owners have unjustly inherited and violently defended. Oh, okay. I initially intended to talk about Ta-Nehisi Coates and Jelani Cobb, but I don't like their work, so I'm not going to. I just focused on the interventions I thought were interesting, so yes, that's shade, but oh well. All right, so It is important, however, to acknowledge critiques of reparations movements. For Adolf Reid, the drive for reparations is a move to make racial peoplehood the basis of political identity, which is built upon the idea that the Black masses lack a proper racial consciousness due to the psychological legacy of slavery. This assumption constructs Black people as defective, pathological, and in need of moral repair. As such, Reid argues reparations is a class project of the Black nationalist petty bourgeoisie who are committed to a racial politics that solidifies their role as guides and brokers. He writes, quote, "Those are, after all, the people who can conduct the finely calibrated analyses that determine what form and magnitude just compensation should take. They are the people who would stand to administer whatever compromise palliatives are likely to ensue from this activity," end quote. Reid further argues that the drive for racial reparations undermines broad-based solidarity politics across race, gender, and other identities for general goods, including universal health care, affordable housing, and quality education. Taking Reid's intervention into account, it is important to emphasize the aspects of reparations programs that seek the radical transformation of society. These, for me, are the anti-capitalist aspects that require the expropriation, socialization, and redistribution of wealth, democratic participation in the shaping of local, national, and global political economic policies, and broad-based international anti-imperialist solidarity politics. So, by way of conclusion, I suppose I should state that I'm deeply ambivalent about reparations. Maybe I'm cynical, but I can't help but think that anything white imperialist capitalists are willing to give may not be worth taking. I don't know. The critical race scholar Derek Bell has written about interest convergence, which is the idea that the interest of Blacks in achieving racial equality will be accommodated only when it converges with the interests of whites, and that the harm imposed upon Blacks and the liability of whites for such harm are subordinated to the ability of any remedy to enhance or secure the interests of the dominant class. One example of this was civil rights concessions during the Cold War that were given or awarded at the expense of the decimation of the Black left and radical internationalism. So Gerald Horne writes extensively about this, that the Black scare was mitigated by the Red scare, whereby you give concessions largely to the Black bourgeoisie, and then you incarcerate, deport, criminalize persons who are asking for fundamental redistribution. He also argues about, what the utility is of arguing to be able to attend or to, frequent lunch counters or stores that you can't afford to eat or shop at. So I'll end with two recommendations wait, hold on, I skipped a part, I think. Okay, so in other words, it seems that when making demands on the state, sincere and good faith struggles generally devolve into negotiating the terms of our immiseration. At the same time, pending revolution, the internationally focused, anti-capitalist-based drive for reparations is perhaps a necessity to hold the line against the increasing destitution and destruction of the world. Now I'll end with two recommendations. The first is that we need to deeply and systematically study the Cold War. Slavery is important, but I think that the Cold War is an overlooked aspect of US history that has had a catastrophic impact on Black and oppressed people. During this era, radical thought and activism was criminalized in a systematic and unprecedented way, not least given the overwhelming consent of folk across the political and racial spectrum. Blacks, Jews, and immigrants suffered immensely from anti-communist witch hunts, and surprise, surprise, these are the groups that are being targeted by white nationalist revanchism. With exorbitant amounts of public monies going to surveilling, prosecuting, deporting, incarcerating, and otherwise terrorizing persons primarily for their ideas, right? Primarily for their ideas. So, and this has had enormous financial costs. So W.E.B. Du Bois was indicted and tried in 1951 ostensibly for acting on behalf of a foreign agent, but in actuality, he was indicted for being the head of the Peace Information Center and for circulating the Stockholm Peace Petition. He was ultimately acquitted, but that trial cost $35,000 in 1950 money, right? And that was after the fact that most of the lawyers were working pro bono, right? So Du Bois had this to say, right? It had not occurred to us how costly justice in the United States is. It is not enough to be innocent in order to escape punishment. You must have money and a lot of it. Another example of the material costs is the case of Paul Robeson. So Paul Robeson was persecuted in many ways given his internationalist activism and advocacy of civil rights for Black folk and peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union. One of those ramifications was that his passport was taken away from 1951 to 1958, which meant that his income went from $100,000 in 1947 to $6,000 by 1952, not least because no public auditoriums or public halls would book him, and all sorts of other, and the cost of just defense. So there's also this case of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, who were executed by the state for ostensibly selling nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union. There is some evidence that Julius Rosenberg did indeed give some obsolete drawings to the Soviet Union, but that Ethel did not. But what's interesting to me is that they were executed for giving these secrets to the Soviet Union, but American eugenicists who provided a lot of the templates for the Nazi regime went off scot-free. So, William Graham Sumner and all these people, they were not prosecuted. But I digress. So, thus, when we think about reparations, we need to also account for those forms of confiscation and dispossession from which we have not recovered today. This normalization of repression is seen today in various ways, from the forever war on terror, for which anti-communism provided the architecture, through to ingrained and endemic intellectual McCarthyism. So my second recommendation is that we think of reparations as an epistemological, ethical, and political project. In terms of epistemology, we have to know, understand, and think about social relations, human interaction in the world in a different way, so that repair and redress indeed prioritize people over profit. To ensure that we all have enough, it is imperative that we adopt a socialist and ecologically responsible ethics in which we are willing to denaturalize and expropriate those who steal, plunder, hoard, and destroy. And politically, we have to come up with strategies in which voting, petitioning the state, protesting for recognition, and hashtag solidarity do not constitute the totality of our approaches and do not overshadow or foreclose more radical and revolutionary possibilities. Thank you.